welcoming you to the one and only session in this entire conference that focuses on primary forests. So I'm very pleased to see that there's at least a handful of people who are concerned about this very important topic. So welcome. The fact that primary forests are not featuring on the whole program sends out a signal that there's a gap, a glaring gap in terms of this important topic for the IUCN and also then for the world. So thanks for being here. In terms of the outline of the program, we're going to have 4 participants who's going to share with us. Firstly, let me introduce myself. I am Rosina Omar, and I'm from South Africa. I head up integrated coastal management in the country, and I work for the Department of Environmental Affairs in South Africa. Our first panelist is Professor Brendan Mackey. He is the Regional Councillor for Oceania, and he is stationed at Griffith University, where he is Director for the Chair for Climate Change Response in Australia, Griffith University. Secondly, well, Brendan, Brendan is going to deliver, just sketch out briefly the issue, grounding it in the core values, the ethics of this important topic. And he'll set the scene for the other 3 participants to follow, and they are Dr. Edward Miller. He will give us an update on Mesoamerica, forest reality. Edward has extensive experience in the whole Latin American region, and he will bring us a perspective, or rather a reality check on what is happening in a whole host of Latin American countries. And then Cyril Comas, who's Vice President for Policy at the Wild Foundation. And Cyril will deliberate whether sustainable industrial logging is really a solution. So whilst Brendan will give us an outline and the context, Edward is going to give us a reality check on what is happening, the status quo with regards to primary forests. Then we'll have a policy dimension, which Cyril will introduce, and he will focus on sustainable industrial logging as an alternative and whether it is indeed a viable solution. And then Virginia Young, who's from the Rainforest Conservation Society. She's going to then look at some solutions and hopefully leaving us with some hope at the end. So that is how we'll spend our time, just to deliberate the issues. We won't be more than an hour to allow for enough participation from the floor. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Brendan. Thanks.
Thank you, Rosina, and welcome. First of all, some statistics and some facts, as well as we know them. About 50% of the world's natural forests have been cleared. That leaves about 4 billion hectares remaining, and about 1.45 billion hectares of that is primary forest. And there I'm really using the FAO definition that they gave in their 2010 World Forest Assessment report. These are forests that have not been subject to industrial economic activity, in particular industrial logging. And if you do the sums, that's about 15% of the world's original forest biome. And if we were trying to meet Aichi targets by biomes, what's the current Aichi target? 17%. That's a map that WCMC put out quite a few years ago. I haven't seen it recently, but it's quite a good map. It shows an estimate of the original distribution of forest and the current distribution of forest. And I think we're all in this room familiar with the ongoing threats from industrial logging, legal and illegal, mining, both corporate and what I call cowboy, cropping for food, biofuel and feedstocks of various kinds, livestock, urbanisation, peri-urbanisation, infrastructure. And by the FAO's estimates, just looking at tropical forests, which is going to be the focus of our talk today, but what we're saying I think applies equally to boreal and temperate forests in many respects. In terms of tropical forests, we lost 15 million hectares per year between 1990 and 2000 and 30 million hectares per year between 2000 and 2010, and this is considered to be underestimates because some countries don't report data, and that's a shot taken by Peter Hitchcock flying over Borneo. I do want to make this point whilst we're focusing on tropical forests, not to lose sight of the fact that primary forest protection is a developed and developing country challenge. This table shows on the left-hand side countries ranked by their area of forest cover, and on the right it shows countries ranked by the other wooded lands, perennial woody shrubland. And on the left-hand side you can see that 3 of the top 5 countries and 4 of the top 7 are developed countries, and the rest are developing countries. And on the right hand side, similarly, we've got 3 of the developed countries in the top 5. So the world's primary forest is actually distributed across the globe. So why care about protecting primary forests? I'm going to talk about 4 reasons. I'm just going to really mention them, and this is, I hope, by way of just prodding your memory. I hope these are facts that you are all generally aware of, though perhaps the climate change ones I've got a bit more detail than what many people will be familiar with. But terrestrial ecosystems do play a critical role in climate change mitigation. We all know that the primary cause of human-forced climate change is emissions of greenhouse gases from burning fossil fuel. But about 30% of the anthropogenic greenhouse gases in the atmosphere are from deforestation and degradation, and annually that's currently between 10 to 15% of total global emissions. So avoiding ecosystem emissions complements the deep cuts that are needed in fossil fuel emissions. It doesn't solve the fossil fuel problem, but it will certainly be a lot worse if we continue to clear and degrade forest ecosystems. So globally, forests store about and these are very approximate figures, 300 billion tonnes of carbon in the living biomass. If that were to be if all those stocks were to be depleted and oxidised, given the way the global carbon cycle works, that would lead up to an increase in atmospheric CO2 of about 136 parts per million. There's about 136 parts per million of atmospheric CO2 that would result if we were to completely deforest the world's remaining forests and oxidise all the living biomass carbon. And of course that doesn't take into account emissions from dead biomass carbon and soil carbon. As I mentioned, about 10% of emissions annually are from deforestation. But that doesn't include emissions from logging. If we account for them, that basically doubles the emissions from deforestation. And Greg Asner wrote a very good paper about the Amazon in that respect. And I do want to show this graph where we're used to seeing these projections from the IPCC, from the climate change models, run out to 2100. This is a graph that's been shared by a colleague who is working on the next IPCC report. He wants to run them out to 2300. Because what they show with business as usual is up to +5 by the end of 2100 and up to +12 by the end of 2200. So, the key to solving the climate change problem is to avoid emissions from both sources, fossil fuel and ecosystems. Avoid emissions. Well, the best way to avoid emissions from forests is to keep forests intact. That's what we mean by avoiding emissions. So the imperative on solving the climate change problem is to avoid emissions from both these primary sources. The second reason to care about protecting primary forests is because of their role in biodiversity conservation, and I've just got 2 points here. One is a quote from a 2011 paper in Nature by Gibson et al., which was entitled "Primary Forests are Irreplaceable for Sustaining Tropical Biodiversity." This was their primary conclusion. We find that most forms of forest degradation have an overwhelming detrimental effect on tropical biodiversity. This is a temperate forest in southeast Australia. That's a person down there, just to give you the scale. Our results clearly indicate that when it comes to maintaining tropical biodiversity, there is no substitute for primary forests. And of course this is important because 2/3 of all land-based plants and animals are found in forests. The third reason to care about protecting primary forests is climate change adaptation. And if you think about that graph I showed, which business as usual leads us to up to +5 by 2100, up to +12 by 2200. And in fact, even if we are successful in mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, totally, the carbon we put up into the atmosphere will continue to interact with the climate for thousands of years. The lifetime of the airborne pulse, the lifetime of the airborne fraction of a pulse of CO2 is not 100 years, it is thousands of years. Because that's how long it takes to work its way through the oceans and gets dissolved into the bottom. So whether we like it or not, whatever we do on mitigation, we're locked into adaptation to the unavoidable impacts of the climate change we are going to experience. And this is a key point. The natural biodiversity of forests and woodlands and other ecosystem types is actually the main mechanism by which ecosystems have resilience in the face of external perturbations, including fire, diseases, invasives, and climate change. This delivers more stable carbon stocks. It makes for more adaptive ecosystems, and it's easy to think about this if we compare a natural ecosystem to a monoculture plantation. The difference in their resilience in the face of any external perturbation is a function of the functionality of their biodiversity. And this includes things like self-regeneration after disturbance, such as fire, resistance to and recovery from pests and diseases, local genetic adaptation to new environmental conditions, and very tight controls on nutrient cycles. And the relationship between biodiversity and ecosystem resilience was reviewed in a paper I did with colleagues that was published by the Convention on Biological Diversity in 2009. There was also a paper published in Science, I think, or Nature, recently, very recently, which was a sister paper which reviews the relationships between biodiversity and productivity. So we've now got very solid scientific evidence of the importance of biodiversity to ecosystem productivity and ecosystem resilience. So the more resilient our ecosystems are, the better they are able to naturally adapt to climate change. A fourth is the traditional values that are associated with forest dwelling people. And in Australia, this is called by Indigenous people as traditional obligations to country. From the West, we tend to talk about as traditional knowledge, and it involves issues of sustainable livelihoods. In all the world's remaining forests, there are forest dwelling people and communities who have been living there for a very long time. And I've just got a quote I wanted to read from Dave Cloudy, who's the traditional owner of the Northern Kanju people in Cape York Peninsula, which, when you look at a map of Australia, is the pointy bit on the top right-hand side, just below West Papua and Papua New Guinea. For the Northern Kanju people living in the Chulalungan and Gujia Northern Kanju, Ngachi or Ngachi, I can't pronounce it properly, the NG's Aboriginal pronunciation. Indigenous cosmology ties together land, flora, fauna and people. The landscape was shaped by ancestral beings or stories that left lore, governance and language. Bloodlines tie people to different tracts of land. These ties are the foundation of Indigenous governance, knowledge, land tenure and land management. This cosmologically based philosophy drives the Kanju people in their effort towards sustainable land management, ecological and socio-cultural restoration, and the reaffirmation of Indigenous knowledge across the northern Kanju nation. So, and these values, this is the basis of their sustainable livelihoods, and it's utterly dependent upon a non-industrialised primary forest. The last one I want to mention, because this is something that is poorly studied in watersheds around the world. I think in North America they use the term watersheds. In Australia and elsewhere we talk about water catchments, but they're the same thing. The fact is the vegetation cover of a catchment, here we have one in southeast Australia, it's a photo of it there. It's the water supply for the city of Melbourne. It's an intact primary forest. And the reason why it's been protected from all land use, including industrial logging, for over 100 years is because of this relationship. This is time here, and this is changes in runoff following a wildfire or clear fell event. And what we see in the more mature forest is there is a greater retention of water in the catchment. More water flows out of the catchment on a more regulated flow rate than in a young regenerating forest. The reason is because of the incredible transpiration rates from these young regenerating eucalyptus redmond's trees. So for this reason, the primary forest has been protected since the 19th century in order to maintain these hydrological relationships. So what I've done very quickly is to, that's not my slide.
It's not your slide, no.
Yeah. It's just very quickly, because I want to leave time for the other speakers. It's just to summarise that set of values that we recognise that belong and derive very much from intact primary forests. Thank you.
Just for housekeeping, we'll just take down your questions or comments, and we'll have a session at the end where you can address all the panelists. Thanks.
Thank you. You saw the numbers of the conference here. 666, that's me. That's the role I have to play now. Well, going back a few years ago, the Mesoamerican region had a beautiful project called Mesoamerican Biological Corridor. It was famous worldwide. Many initiatives. One of the reasons we had war in the region, so we had lots of international support. Once the peace process came through, and since we don't have very much oil, there was a lot of organizations leaving the region. This is one of the high biodiversity regions, and today things are changing. I'll just go through a few examples. These are the protected areas in the region under protectplanet.net, and these are the accumulated fires from 2002 to 2012. So we can see that, and I'll go and zoom in some of these regions. Basically, the only patches that are not burnt are because they are protected areas. The rest of the land is burnt. Here is in the Yucatan Peninsula, and if you look, if you look here at this area of Calakmul, this is Calakmul, and this is a Maya Biosphere Reserve. That's where you see a little bit of non-burnt area. If you go down to the Maya Biosphere Reserve, which was, since it was declared by UNESCO, it has lost 45% of its forest cover. And in any year during the dry period, you can see the satellite images, the forest burning. Most of the area that has been burnt down is roads that were open to access the oil that were there. And actually, some of the area that has not been burnt down is community-managed concessions for forestry use. We have another additional problem all over the region, which is the drug business and the laundry of money. So they're cutting down forests and putting down cattle. And these cattle ranches produce millions of dollars a year in exports, even though they don't have much cattle on them. But it's a good laundry. So you can see actually the border between Mexico and Guatemala. And if you look in slides 10 years ago, it was a very definite thing. So even in Guatemala now, in this region, which is where the oil drilling was in that national park, you can see the deforestation happening there. And here you can see the fires in those 10 years in the Maya Biosphere Reserve. And this area here is a community-managed concessions. And here it's actually still not accessible because of lack of roads. So this is actually an area also filled with archaeological things. So there you have the image again. If you go to Honduras and Nicaragua, it's scary how much they burn a year. And those patches here are also, this is a World Heritage Site.